Welcome to Association Forum's Conversation Circle, Words Matter, Race and Rhetoric. I am Michelle Mason with Association Forum. Today is an opportunity for us to continue our conversations around racial inequities and race relations. Joining us today is Dr. Cedric Burrows, who will examine how words we use have racial inequitable undertones, as well as also rhetoric surrounding those words in mainstream places. But before we hear from Dr. Burrows, as well as our program facilitator, Marquis Miller, I'd like to introduce our sponsor, Travel Portland, James Jesse. We at Association Forum believe that partners make it possible, and without the support of Travel Portland, we would not be here today. So thank you, James.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for having me today. Travel Portland is a preferred partner of Association Forum, and we're very proud with our Association Forum partnership. You know, Travel Portland believe we lead with our values, and we believe our greatest value are our values. So we believe that this topic here is very timely, and we're glad to be associated with it. We're proud of our partnership with Association Forum, and over the past 3 years, our partnership with Association Forum, especially with the Welcoming Environment Initiative. We believe that the Welcome Environment Initiative is very timely for our industry and these times that we're going through now. And we wholeheartedly support the notion that valuing differences is a 21st century expectation. So welcome to the session today. Travel Portland is proud to be a sponsor of today's session, and I'm very looking forward to hearing today's information. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And again, thank you so much for your partnership, particularly during this time. We know the pressures that the travel and tourism industries are under. So we thank you so much for your leadership and staying involved with us. I am very excited to welcome today's program facilitator, Marquis Miller. Marquis is the City of Chicago's first Chief Diversity Officer. He is currently serving as an executive level strategist in the city's new Office of Equity and Racial Justice, and is responsible for developing and implementing the city's policies and strategies for recruiting and maintaining a workforce that reflects the diversity of the Chicago's population. So we're really excited to have Marquis with us today. Welcome, Marquis.
Good morning, and good morning to all of you who are participating. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I am exceptionally pleased to be participating in this conversation because, as some of you in the Chicago area know, there are still a lot of issues taking place in our communities and in our downtown Loop area. There are still challenges with the perception that our communities still have lots of inequity. And most recently, we are currently experiencing some challenges around some looting that's taken place. And I think it's at this point that these kinds of discussions become so much more essential in not just understanding why these things are happening, but also in looking for solutions so that we can collectively move forward.
A little technical issue there. Thank you so much, Marquis, for joining us today. We're really excited about the conversation we'll have, and thank you for setting the expectations or sharing with us what's currently happening in the city today. We're also excited for your program facilitation with Dr. Cedric Burrows. We're excited that he is going to help us understand some of the nuances behind the words that we use in everyday mainstream spaces. Dr. Cedric Burrows is an assistant professor in the English department where he researches and teaches courses in writing, cultural rhetorics, African-American rhetoric, and cultural social movements, as well as protest literature at Marquette University. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Burrows earned a BA from Alcorn State University, MA from Miami University, and a PhD from the University of Kansas. His upcoming book, rhetorical crossover, the Black rhetorical presence in white culture, will be released this fall, I believe in October, through the University of Pittsburgh Press. He will examine the alterations of African American rhetoric when it comes into mainstream spaces. So we're really thrilled to hear the insights from Dr. Burrows. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Burrows.
Thank you, Michelle. And, thank you for having me. And good morning, everyone. So have a PowerPoint slide that I want to upload. So see how I can work this here. Oh. Let's see. See, my screen sharing is not working. See this. Okay. So the presentation on words matter, race, and rhetoric. So first off, I want to just give a definition about what is rhetoric in itself. So a lot of times when we hear about rhetoric, it's usually not in the best light. It's usually something that's negative, and especially now in this climate that when people hear rhetoric, they think that somebody is just using words just for the sake of it. It's a lot of flowery language, but it's actually a real set definition to it. And so what is rhetoric? So rhetoric itself is a set of communication practices grounded in a shared cultural understanding that is used to create meaning. So what I mean by that is that the culture has a particular set of values that they have, and so they use rhetoric as a way to convey those ideas, and so it shows what they value. So like one example is with the traffic light here. So rhetoric is communicated here. So for example, red means stop, yellow means to slow down, and green means go. There's no real reason why we use red as a form of stop, but most people associate red with something that's urgent. And so that's why we use red for it to mean stop for a traffic light. Then another example is one of the gas stations. So you see the prices. So like one is for 99 cents. So why do we say 99 cents as opposed to $1? That even though it's a psychological price, and that it shows that people may like something more if it appears less, even though 99 cents, $1 is not much difference, but psychologically it makes a difference to people. And so it's trying to communicate something cheaper. So that's an example of how rhetoric works in society. It's a way to convey meaning to people. So that's the general aspect of communication. So then we go into something more detailed with language itself. So what is language itself? Is an arbitrary system of symbols used to convey meaning. So it's the same way with rhetoric, that there's not essentially a rhyme or reason why we use particular symbols to associate with words, but we do, and it's a way to convey a particular ideology associated with those words. And so words have a very complex, I would say, history for society, and that they're used to explain a reality, but it's also used to transmit cultural values. So how we understand words depends upon who says it. So it's not, the word itself isn't necessarily problematic, but it's the meaning we attach to those words. And also it depends on who says it. So one person can say the same word, but it may have different meanings because of that person's background. And so that goes to the idea that what I tell people is that we're all walking texts, that history and culture influences the way we communicate. And so that affects the way people see us when we communicate things. And so imagine you have all these walking texts in society where they come from various cultures and backgrounds. And even though they may say the same words, because of who they are, their word has a particular history attached to it. Let's see. So this goes with the idea of power. So power is a very important part of it. So even though we may say the same words, culture, history, and power dynamics influences the meaning. So for example, boy, it means typically represents the gender of a young male person, generally speaking. However, it has a different meaning depending upon who says it. So for example, boy, historically used by whites as a derogatory term for black men. And so in that case, it has a different meaning. Yeah, but within African American culture, among African American men, it could be used to represent brotherhood. So you may say, that's my boy. And so within that, it has a different meaning as opposed to when somebody who's not from that community says that word to someone else. And so it shows that there's a power hierarchy within words. So because those words have been layered with a lot of history and background, it depends upon who says it and how they say it in a lot of cases. So even images have the same type of historical and cultural references. So this is one from Vogue from 2008. And so it's with LeBron James and the model Giselle. And so what happened is that when people saw this, a lot of people said this has a lot of cultural, historical connotations to it, and a lot of racial connotations to it because of the way he's standing and the way she's standing and the way they're positioned, that it has a lot of racial background to it. And so they connected it to a poster like this. And so this is from World War I, where it's talking about destroy the mad brute. And so this goes back to an era where African-American men especially were seen as subhuman and that they were out to lynch white women. And so this is, some people say this is a harkening back to some of those historical moments. And so it depends upon who sees it, because some people saw they didn't see that, but then people who had the historical and cultural background and aware of it, that when they see it, they say that this is a remnant of a particular time in history. So a lot of things that we see, we may not realize it, but it's grounded in a lot of things in history. And so that's where the controversy occurs in a lot of cases. So how did rhetoric and language contain racial undertones? So I put it into three categories. So one is the more overt, where ones that we know specifically are racist themselves. And then we have those that are covert, that those are ones that as time goes on, the meaning changes or we attach racialized meanings to them, even though they didn't begin that way. And then we have what I call guilt by association of sorts, that because of a historical moment, that the word itself has become attached to that historical period. And so when people hear that word, that it harkens them back to a particular time in history. So now I'm just trying to give a more explanation related to those three categories. So with overt, so these are the words, images, and symbols that are blatantly racist. So usually grounded in racist stereotypes used to demean African Americans, subservient to whites, or as childlike beings. So most of these were developed during a period where Rafer Logan described as a nadir of race relations. So typically this was a period of, let's say, after Reconstruction, so around 1877 up until what I term around the time of World War II. And so this is when historically it was a period when race relations hit their lowest point in the United States. Now, some people say that we may have hit it now, but this is kind of like the peak period of it after Reconstruction and before World War II. So Logan himself says it ended around 1901, but I say it went further than that. So this was a period where during the Compromise of 1877, where Rutherford B. Hayes was considered the president. And so in return, he removed the troops from the South during Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction began to collapse. And so all the elected Black officials in a lot of areas, they were removed by force, a lot of times through violence. And so that's when you had a white majority in the South, and that this majority, especially within Congress, would influence American culture for the next about 70 so years. And then you also had a lot of increased violence against African Americans. And so you had lynchings during this time as well. And even in popular culture, you had a lot of blatant stereotypes related to African Americans. So this is where you see a lot of those racial tropes that gained a lot of popularity during this time. And so, as we say, with language and culture, all this is evidence with the racism and anti-Blackness, and it all appears in the language and rhetoric itself. And so some examples of that is the use of the N-word as a racial insult. So the word itself comes to us from Latin. So Niger. So it literally means black in Latin. And there's actually a country in Africa, the Niger River there in Africa, that based on their Latin term. And so the word that we get as a pejorative term comes to us from Portuguese. So it wasn't really used as an overt insult for the most part. It was used interculturally. And so it was used in the 19th century, but then in the 19th century, it gains its more negative connotation, especially in the late 19th century. And so that's where it really becomes seen as an ugly term to describe African Americans. So that's when this word really is used to insult or demean African Americans in this case. Another one was known as coon songs. And so these were songs that popularized stereotypes of African Americans. So these were based out of the minstrel shows of the 19th century. So when we see like blackface, for example, all of that comes from this particular era of minstrel shows. So what happened was that you had white performers who saw African Americans during slavery singing folk songs or things like that grounded in their culture. What happens when it transferred over into white culture, it was used to mock, demean, and insult African Americans. And so it was played up for laughs and entertainment. So this is also where you get like Jim Crow, the performance of that. And so later on that was used as a way, because it was associated with African Americans, as a way to talk about segregation. Right. Then you had Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, Rastas from Cream of Wheat. They were all used in advertising. Also, the word aunt and uncle was used to demean African Americans. It was used to describe old African Americans, this idea that they were nurturing or father-like or mother-like figures or things like that, so they were beneath them. And so this was transferred into advertising as well. And so I know there's been a lot of talk of changing those images or retiring those images because they were based off those stereotypes as well. So all those things were overt things that we saw in society. Even children's songs were used to demean African Americans. So, for example, we may have heard "Itty Meeny Miny Mo, catch the tiger by his toe. If he hollers, let it go." And it was changed in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was called "Itty Meeny Miny Mo, catch the N-word by the toe. If he hollers, let it go." And so you'll see that, especially a lot in music, that a lot of even music that we hear now is grounded in a lot of overt racial language. So, for example, if you're familiar with the song Old Man River, that the original text of that had the N-word all through the song itself. And so it was really emphasized in pop culture. And ironically, though, some of those stereotypes resulted in some interesting responses, especially with African Americans. So, for example, we look at coon songs, that there was actually a song called "Every Race Has a Flag But the Coon." That was actually the song. And so Marcus Garvey heard this song, and so he responded by creating a Pan-African flag that we see with red, green, and black. And so it was used as a response to those negative stereotypes. Another one is "In the Word Heaven." So this referred to the balcony section of a building where African Americans sit. So we hear a lot now about that phrase, the peanut gallery. And so there was also another phrase used because that was where people could sit in the cheap seats, and also that's where they get them peanuts and they would throw them at the audience or something like that. And because of segregation, because Black people were only confined to the balcony, that's where they said it was associated with them. But before that, it was the word "In the Word Heaven," because this were the places where there's only section that they were allowed to be in theaters. Okay. Then there's a covert. So as a nadir ended around World War II. And part of the reason why it ended was because of some of the things related to World War II, this idea of democracy. And so the idea is, how can the United States be a supporter of democracy around the world when it treated people in their country with such harm and disrespect? And so it began to change various ideas. Also, educational systems slowly began to change, and it began to change the perception of African Americans. And though you saw more African Americans become more visible, non-stereotypically in the mainstream as well. So you had the period of Negro First, where you had like Jackie Robinson, for example, the first African American to great Major League Baseball, and within 50 or so years. So you had Marian Anderson performing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So you began to see African Americans in less stereotypical roles. And so it began to change some views on African Americans, and also he began to be in the civil rights movement as well. And so as the society changes, the overt words began to change as well. It didn't change overnight, but it began a slow ebb of change. And so a lot of those words that were used overtly were either removed or altered because they was considered too racist in those cases. However, you have the more blatant words become replaced with covert words that became subtly associated with racism. So because they were still ambiguous enough that people not in the know would probably not associated with it, there were a lot of people within the know who used those words to ground them in racism, and it soon became code words for things related to racism. So for a lot of people, they thought the words themselves were innocent itself, but those within who understood its purpose, the racial tones were apparent for the most part. So for example, you saw the beginning of some phrase like the silent majority. So this was used with, for example, President Richard Nixon in the late 1960s, and it was code for the white majority in the second half of the 20th century. So we began to really see a lot of covert words during this period, because especially with Nixon talking about the Southern strategy, so attracting white Southern Democrats who wanted to leave the party because of desegregation, and they wanted to move into the Republican Party, and so this was a Southern strategy. And so these, what people call dog whistle politics, and so a lot of those contain a lot of those covert words themselves. Another one is states' rights. So on the surface, states' rights means that rights that states should have, that shouldn't include the federal government, that it's unique to that particular state. But this is also grounded in a lot of history as well. So it was grounded in, let's say, for example, Civil War, where they were saying that slavery was an issue with the states instead of the federal government. You also have it as well during the Civil Rights Movement, where they were saying the whole idea of desegregation was an issue of states' rights. And so it has that layered history associated with race. And then you even have Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, which ran on the platform of states' rights as well. So this example of, instead of being overt about it, you use covert language as a way to appeal to people. Another one is urban. So urban, we hear a lot of, is used when marketing products for an African-American audience. So you see, for example, I was in a bookstore in Barnes & Noble a couple of weeks ago, and they had an urban section, and it was usually all the books written by African Americans, and there's even a subgenre that's talking about the street life. And so there was a way to say it was particularly for African Americans. So you even have urban clothing, you have urban music, which is a big one in marketing, where you have urban contemporary, and it's used as a euphemism for Black music. So some people even say R&B, rhythm and blues, is a euphemism of Black music as well. And so it's a way of segregating at things in advertising without actually saying that you're doing it. So like, for example, like I said, music is the best example of that. So urban programming, so as a way to segregate your various audiences. And so in doing so, that you may probably not put as much money into something because it has a particular market, or you may ignore it and emphasize other areas of a particular demographic. So music is the best example of that when we talk about urban. Even within music, you may hear another phrase called blue-eyed soul. And so that's usually mean white singers who sing with a Black aesthetic, as they say. And so that's used in a lot of cases now in music as well. Another one is thug, which originated in India. And so as of late, a lot of people now associate thug as a replacement for the N-word. So because you can't say the N-word now, people attach the meaning that they would with the N-word onto thug. And so thug has another connotation in recent society. Another one is ghetto. So it was ideally meant to be a case where a community is forcibly placed within one section of an area. And so now it has this negative connotation associated with anything related to Blackness. So when people say, well, that is so ghetto, or that's ghetto, that people inadvertently related to African Americans in a lot of cases. So it still has that negative connotation. So when people say that word ghetto, it has a history behind it, and it's now considered racialized history as well. Hood is often connected to Black working class neighborhoods. So when people say I live in the hood, or when somebody says there's hood, then in some ways it also could be synonymous with using the word ghetto in some cases. So when people think that ghetto may be too harsh of a statement, sometimes they may replace it and use the word hood in that case. So another one is the association. So historically, these words had neutral connotations associated with them. However, because of historical events, again, these words contain racial undertones. So it's usually associated with a particular period in history. And because it's the word sprung up during this time, that most people now associate that word with that particular time in history. And it's used associated with those events that were connected to some of racism or racist behavior. So some examples. So you may hear a lot talking about antebellum now, especially with, there was a country group called Lady Antebellum. And so they had to change their name because it was considered to be associated with slavery. So when most people hear antebellum, it's associated with slavery in the American South before the Civil War. So literally the word antebellum means before the war, anything that happened before war occurred. But because of history, most people mark it as the antebellum period. So it's usually the time of plantations, of slaves, of a romanticized view of slavery in the American South. And so people think of antebellum, they may associate with something like, let's say, a Gone with the Wind, of this romanticized view of how people thought of the South as something where it's like a Gone with the Wind motif, usually. Plantation is connected to slavery in the American South as well. So plantation literally means a large area that's used for farming, raising crops. But because plantations were in use a lot during slavery, during that period, that most people, when they hear that word plantation, is usually associated with slavery in the American South. And so you may even hear phrases like plantation blinds, and that's another one of associating things with a form of history with slavery. Lynching is another one that talks about extrajudicial killings of African Americans in the United States. So lynchings themselves were used within American culture, like in the 18th, early 19th century. And it was usually in places that didn't have a judicial system in place. And so this was a way of people to try to create some form of justice, I would say. But what happened is that in the late 19th century, it acquires a racialized ideology with it. So what happened was that before, let's say, the 1880s, lynching, most of the people who were lynched were white men. However, after the 1880s and beyond, majority of the people who were lynched were African Americans. And even have some Mexican Americans who were also lynched as well, but the majority of them were African Americans. And so lynching took on a racialized tone. And so for now, when we think of lynching, we think of the period of the 1880s and beyond, where a lot of extrajudicial killings were of African Americans. So when people talk about somebody string somebody up on a tree or lynch, or would say those words, it has an automatic connection to what happened during that time in history. Another one as well is the word Dixie. So Dixie itself has been associated with the American South. So ironic thing was that the author of Dixie, the song, was a Northerner, but it was used in the South, especially during the Civil War. And it also contains a lot of negative connotation because of Civil War, slavery, of this idea of romanticizing slavery again. And it was also used during the Civil Rights Movement when people were protests, that a lot of people on the sidelines would start playing Dixie as a way to counter their protests. And so Dixie, the song especially, has a lot of racial connotations to it. And even thinking of the word Dixie itself, that when people think of Dixie, that it has a particular negative association related to the South as well. So what are some ways to become more aware of racially coded language? So one thing I suggest to people is to be more historically aware of the words that we say. That especially I tell people that a lot of things that we say are grounded in history. So this is why it's important for us to research and understand history, because history, if you read historical documents or things related to the past, you'll see a lot of those words come up. And if you see those words come up, that you'll be aware of where they originated from, what context were they used, what purpose did they have, and that you understand the historical grounding to it, then you're less likely to want to use it later. Another one is to research idiomatic phrases, because a lot of those phrases that we use are idioms that they are used in popular culture. And so we should research why we say those particular phrases as well. So this connects to history, but it's also just a case of when using slang or things like that, why do we say the words that we do? What are some of the historical underpinning associated with it? And so all these related to the idea of studying cultures as well. So this is the value of studying cultures, because in order to understand someone's language or rhetoric or their rhetorical practices, that you have to understand that it's grounded in a particular rationale for their culture. So it's kind of like when you study another language, that not only do you study a language, but you also study the culture surrounding it to get a better understanding about how to communicate with it. So this is the same way, that once you understand the culture and how they shape things and how history influenced them, then you understand the words and phrases that are used as well. And also to recognize the values of an audience as well. So audience is key within this, because we come from various cultural backgrounds. And so because of how we're raised, we may not think the word has any particular connotations to them, but then they really do. And so in learning the culture, you learn audience awareness, that what do the audience values, what do they not? And even some words can have a particular connection to other words, and so they may be seen as derogatory. So how to be aware of that and to be more astute about knowing who your audience and how to communicate that. So here's one further reading. So I have a whole book about this, and it's going to be released in October, called Rhetorical Crossover, the Black Presence and White Culture. And so this is one where it talks about how when it happens when Black rhetorical presence have moved in the mainstream. So this idea that African Americans, they create a culture within their culture, but then it moves into the dominant spaces. And then what happens is that the dominant space is reinvented, and they use coded narratives about how African Americans should appear and behave when in majority spaces. So African Americans create a culture that's unique for them. It's in response to a lot of racial dynamics as well. And so it's grounded in that history, but then when it moves into spaces, it becomes seen as something that's entertaining or something that needs to be controlled. And so in response, African Americans revisit their own narratives and develop their own structure. They revise and reinvent mainstream narratives while also reaffirming their humanity. So they create a culture, is presented in the mainstream reinterprets it for their own purposes, and then in response, they recreate it. So it's almost like a cyclical process in a way. But in the process that we learn about how narratives get coded, how they get framed, how they get racialized, and how we should be aware of that when we communicate with each other. So in thinking about the way we communicate, we have to be aware that we're not just saying words, but we're saying something that's grounded in the whole culture. And so when we think about that we're representative of our historical and cultural moment, then we should also be aware that other people are as well. And so in doing so, we value the cultures that people come from. And so in response, we value each other in the process. So now I'll leave it up to questions for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Burrows. Our first question today is, I've heard that the N-word is okay for Black people to use towards each other. You do hear it occasionally in movies. What are your thoughts about this? Is it not considered disrespectful, period?
Oh, okay. So that's a case where it depends upon the community. So in linguistics, they call it anti-language. So this is a case where a word that's been used in a derogatory sense by the mainstream, it could be reinvented within the culture as another form. So people who are not from that culture can't say it because they don't have that same shared knowledge or cultural history. And so within the culture, it could be seen in various forms. So within Black culture, sometimes it could be seen as a form of a term of endearment. It could be something that's negative. It just depends on the context of how people communicate. And so there's also been a debate about the fact that when in African American circles that they don't use the ER version of it, it's used with A. And so they make a distinction between using the word with the ER versus the word that ends with A. And so it's saying that most people within the culture clips it with an A. And so it's saying within the culture that they can use it in various forms because they understand how it's used within that particular context. But those outside of culture can't use it because it's also related to power dynamics. It also relates to a whole history about how it's been used to demean African Americans. So outside the culture, it's not advisable to use that word. Within the culture, it depends on how they want to use it within themselves. It's kind of like a case of, like, I guess with family, where in the family, you may say certain things with each other, but you don't want somebody outside the family to say those words because they don't have their understanding or their shared history or things like that. And so I think of it as liking it to the same way that within the culture, people understand how it's used and what circumstance or things like that. But outside the culture, there's not that same understanding. And so that's where the problems occur because they're not in that group, that culture. So, yeah.
So, Dr. Burrows, let me also ask you this question, and we will continue to get to questions that are in the chat. You touched on why language is so important. Can you share more about how we can learn from others by using positive language?
So like using words that have a connotation with positivity?
Yeah, so for example, the question in the chat is using words you show is associated with covert racism without any intent of them pertaining to Blacks or any other demographic group. And so the participant used examples like silent majority and states' rights. He is asking, what do you suggest be used as replacement words in conversation? I'm going to make the assumption that he means using replacement words that continue to keep the conversation positive.
Mm-hmm. So in those cases, because of the history behind it, that sometimes that, and also because it's used for something negative, I would say you eliminate the word altogether, because when you eliminate the word, you eliminate the whole concepts that surround what you're trying to do with it. So like say with states' right, because you know that is something that has a whole history behind it, you can replace it, and you can may say something like sovereignty or something like that, and it could have a positive meaning in its original intention. But if people just transfer the ideas from states' rights to sovereignty, then it becomes negative again. So it's a case, the word itself isn't sometimes a problem. It's a case that the meaning that we give behind it. So it's a case where if we change the meaning and try to make it more positive or change the ideology surrounding it, then that's when you can have something that's a positive word. So it's a case where you can change the words all the time, but unless you actually change the ideologies that shape the word to look at something that's negative, then it won't really make that much difference. It's about changing the ideology of why the word itself is negative in the first place. Does that help?
I would think that that helps. It may help with the person that sent the message in the chat. But since this conversation was titled "Words Matter: Race and Rhetoric," and if we can, at least at this juncture, agree that the concept of racism is imbued with the use of race and power in ways that are not positive, how do we use language to heal and build within our organizations and within our communities?
So let's say with business organizations, so one is that you can create, let's say, terms that promote something that's positive. And so this idea with words that you create a word that has a positive connotation. So think about the word, how you would define the word, and also the audience for it. So And as we see a lot in academia where people can create a word. And so when they create the word, they define it because they can be aware that their word may have so many definitions for people. And so they define the word, then you give some characteristics of their word. So that way everybody has a shared knowledge about the concept surrounding their word. And so, and using it in discourse and re-emphasizing a lot of times that you want to make sure that it's used in a positive light. And so as more people become aware of it, then that's way that it becomes considered a positive term in a way.
That's a very good answer. Can you give an example of rhetorical crossover?
Okay. Any period in time? Oh.
How about if you use it in this particular context? Because I think that the value of these kinds of conversations is to help all of the participants understand, or at least put some meaning to what is happening, why it may be happening, and what they can do to mitigate anything negative happening for themselves and their communities.
Okay. So my area is in civil rights rhetoric, and so I use that example. So let's say one I really was aware of and studying was about Martin Luther King Jr. So towards the end of his life, I would say, well, more, I'll back up. So I would say 1963, 1964, what I call Dr. King's peak rhetorical crossover years. So I Have a Dream speech. He was Times Man of the Year, the Nobel Peace Prize. So when mainstream society, he was considered to be this forefront of civil rights movement, the leader and symbol of peace. But then, let's say later on in late 1960s, he talks about poverty, Vietnam, and so his status becomes more negative in society. People have a negative view of him. That he's assassinated. Then after that, his image is reinvented when it crosses over in the mainstream as the dreamer. So people, for example, that they remember I Have a Dream and about this idea of brotherhood or integration, but then they forget his earlier part of speech where we say we come to cash a check and it's marked insufficient funds because they're bankrupt. He also goes against police brutality in the speech, but we don't hear that part during King's holiday. We just hear the part about I Have a Dream. So that when his image crosses over in the mainstream, it's usually seen as the dreamer or this person who fought for civil rights, but he himself wasn't able to see it, kind of like Moses. And so we only cut off some of his ideology, but not talk about the full king. And so when we use his quotes or things like that in society, it's usually one-sided or reinterpreted to fit into this larger thing that America has overcome as racism, without realizing for example, his later speeches where he really criticizes the structure of American society. So it's saying that when images of African American, when it crosses over in the mainstream, that the image itself becomes watered down into something that's more palpable for a wider audience, because to have all those other ideologies there, then it gives a very complex view, and it's also something that we're connected to now in society. But only talking about integration or brotherhood or things like that, it seems like an idealistic standpoint, saying it's something that we already overcome. So that's kind of like the more obvious ones, that when we talk about the civil rights movement, especially, that is something was always in the South. When we hear the narratives, it's always about Black and white coming together. And it was one of this idea that we solved it because we desegregated things with the Civil Rights Act. Not realizing that we had rebellions in the 1960s. There were people talking about economic disparities, that it was also in the North as well. That is a lot of things that we choose not to talk about within that history. Or even now people reviewing slavery and Reconstruction, that when Reconstruction was taught in a lot of schools, it was seen as a failure. They're saying that slaves got power too soon, and so they weren't able to handle it, and so they were susceptible to corruption. But the real truth of the matter is that you had African Americans who were in power, or men rather, and they were the ones who instituted a lot of social policies within the South. So, for example, free education, infrastructure, helping those in need. But we don't hear their story. And so this idea that things have to be reinvented for a dominant audience that doesn't want complex narratives.
So here's a couple of additional questions. There's, I think, two questions in one. you recommend learning the historical significance of words and phrases. Where do you start? And then alongside of that, are there resources to learn more about covert and overt words to avoid? I think people are looking for helpful resources to offer to people to help increase their awareness. There's a lot of interest in how we are communicating with each other and within communities, as well as across communities. Can you offer some of those suggestions? And then we'll ask Michelle and James if they also want to chime in.
Okay. Well, I know there's a whole field of study that's called etymology, where you do the study of word origins there. And so, trying to think of one off the top of my head. So many of them, because I know there's ones that are based about like words that come from the Bible. There's some from Greek. So I know I can't think of words off the top of my head, but I know there's a whole field of it. And so, say that if you actually start with that and actually research the field of etymology, there's a lot of resources about that. And so I know one that talks about Greek and Roman words especially. And so that's one way to start, because a lot of our words come from that. But let's see, one off the top of my head is Randall Kennedy's book. And it's the N word. It spells the word out. It's called A Strange History of a Troublesome Word. It actually talks about how that word has been used in society in a lot of cases, but also reading history books, because a lot of history books talk about words as well. That especially if you're talking about, let's say, the civil rights movement, that a lot of times a lot of images and words are discussed throughout a lot of those historical books. So one especially I know is African American History by Darlene Clark Hine, who's a big historian of African American history. Another one is John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom, that talks about that in images and things of that nature. Adam Fairclough's books about the civil rights movement, that a lot of them talk about words or images that were used with a lot of racial undertones to it. So yeah, history is a good way to describe, because most people think it's just talking about what happened at that time, but they go in a lot of detail about the strategies that were used in that time, and also how words were used as well. I mean, especially thinking about Nixon, that a lot of research has been done about using the Southern strategy or using states' rights. That researching that history is very important as well.
Michelle or James, do you have anything to add to our conversation?
I have very little to add to the conversation, as I am starting to research this new area of opportunity for us to understand, the connotation, the historical context of words. And as we go on this journey of race relations together, I think that we'll all learn and we'll all understand what they mean, particularly for our environments. Within association form, a positive to your point earlier, Dr. Burrows, a positive way for us to explain our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts is through the Welcoming Environment Initiative. And that positive context is simply a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness for everyone, all to feel equitable in our space. James, you might.
I echo Michelle's comments there, and thank you, Marquis. I have very little to add here, and this is very much a learning experience for me also, and I very appreciate the context that's put along with everything and all the information presented here, as they're very helpful, because even as an African-American person myself, these are great lessons for me also, so thank you.
So Dr. Burrows, in the time that we've got remaining, there are some questions about how words get used or get interpreted as positive or negative. Sometimes people will take a word or a phrase negatively, and it may in fact not have that intent. Can you speak to a couple of the instances you referenced, like, for example, the Vanity Fair cover with LeBron James, as well as the use of terms like states' rights? And can you talk a little bit about the reason why it's important to learn more about the history and the meaning behind how these terms come around?
Sure. So I guess the foundation of rhetoric and language, I would say, is reality. That rea- what we say and how we say it is grounded in the way we see our reality and where we come from and where we grew up. And so I grew up, let's say, for example, in the American South. And so I remember being in an area where you saw like Confederate flags or statues or things like that. And so when I would see like those stories about Gone with the Wind or things like that, but because of my background, I had a particular reaction to it. Whereas I would have friends who didn't grow up in that environment. And so their reality then, let's say that they had that same reaction. And so there was a case where we had to sit down and talk about our realities and how we grew up. And in the process, we also talked about some of the words that we said, some of the phrases that we said. And I explained to them why I considered that offensive when they didn't think it was. And so this was our way of having dialogue with each other. So it's a case where we have to realize that we live in a very segregated society. We live in a very segregated country. And so it wasn't really just by choice. It was really by a lot of things beyond our control or design. And so when we understand that, then that's when we have to understand that everybody may not see our worldview the same way. And in doing so, we are more aware of the audiences that we have to communicate with, so that when we say our particular words, then we may have to be aware of how it may relate to particular groups. So when we see certain images, how those images may transpire. And so this is the foundation of what I think diversity really means. Because talking about words that can have a certain connotation with it, that some people think that diversity means that you just have people from various backgrounds there. And it's just like, well, it's not that. What it means is that you have people from various backgrounds there, but they're there because they make sure that one narrative doesn't become the dominant narrative for everybody. And it reminds people that there's multiple ways of seeing things, multiple ways of knowing things, multiple ways of saying things. And so this is the foundation of why diversity is important. It's not just to say that you want diversity, but you want them there because you want to prevent having one dominant story, one dominant narrative become the foundation for everything, and to realize that not everybody may come from the same background, see the things you do, that you have to be aware that you can look at it from multiple ways, so that way you have more of a cultural understanding for your company. That's the inclusion part of it. So it's not enough to be diverse, but to make people feel they're involved, that their stories matters, that their words matter, that their culture matters in that case.
And I would add that for many people who are participating here, they may be hearing the term equity being used as well. And for my organization, as well as many of your organizations, diversity, equity, and inclusion have become key words, key phrases, key terms that are going to be used going forward to think about, as Dr. Burrows states, the issue of representation, which diversity addresses, the issue of belonging, which inclusion addresses, but then there is the issue of equity, which really speaks to outcomes, and those outcomes not merely being robbing Peter to pay Paul, as it were, but really finding a way for all people to have what they need to thrive, irrespective of or regardless of their race. That's where we probably have the greatest challenges. So now, where do we go from here, Dr. Burrows? How do we move forward? How do we ensure that learning more through this presentation, certainly picking up your book when it is published, and looking at other resources, how do we now see this use of language helping us heal and move forward, or heaven forbid, holding us back?
So I guess this goes with the case where, going back, we're talking about diversity and inclusion, even equity, that let's say in a company. So let's say when you talk about your diversity, so how do you define it specifically for your company? That it's become like this word that becomes a catch-all for a lot of people, but it has various meanings for a lot of people as well. And so what does it mean to be diverse? So let's say, what is your plan for a company, about how you define it? What are some characteristics, or what are some goals that you want to have within that company to illustrate let's say, diversity in that case, that what are some specific steps that you're going to make within the company to fulfill those goals? And then what happens if, let's say, the goals change or it may not fulfill their goals? What do you do then? So it's a case of actually putting resources into what you say by, if you want a diverse group or a diverse workforce, that what efforts are you going to make in terms of, let's say, recruitment, and that also think about the words that you say. So I guess even thinking about in the world of work, where I hear this when I work at a university, when I've been on job committees, where people say, we want the most qualified person. So then when I would ask them, what do you mean by qualified? Because I would imagine that if people are going to apply for a job, they must have some qualifications, or else you wouldn't want to interview them. So then what does it mean by qualified? And also, are there some connotations associated with that word qualified? Because I remember when people talked about affirmative action, for example, they say we don't want minority hire or something, like they want the most qualified. But then realizing that qualified can also think about power dynamics, because there are people who are able to get resources like internships where other people couldn't, because they may have had to work several jobs, and so they may not have been able to get those resources as well. So then when you say qualified, what does that really mean? That sometimes we say the word, but we don't actually know what that word really means for a lot of people, or it has so many different connotations for people. So that if you even say that word, you may have to explain what does that really mean. So some people may say, instead, we want somebody who can fit into the environment of the company or something like this. So it's kind of like as a way to get around saying qualified, but even still, you still have to define what you mean by that. So this, I say, where words, they can have multiple definitions to them. Make sure that you have a set definition. And so when you have a definition, you can look at it, and then you can think about, okay, is there some things that we may need to revise, re-understand, because that definition may be culturally grounded as well. So just be more conscious about how we define the words, what characteristics associated with that word as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle and to our host, James Jesse, for any closing thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burrows, for this education. We really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you, particularly around the orientation of words. It's definitely a learning experience for me as well, and it requires more study, and look forward to bringing this education to Association Forum. Thank you, Marcus, for your excellent facilitation. We appreciate your engagement in Association Forum and the work that you do on behalf of the City of Chicago in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that said, I'll turn it over to James Jesse, our sponsor, for closing remarks.
Again, thank you, Michelle, for this session here, and to Dr. Burrows and Mr. Miller. Thank you for a great session and great facilitation. Obviously, this is a topic that probably deserves more time, and from the questions that we saw from the gallery here, but definitely appreciate the professional information provided here, and it definitely provides a platform for us to think further on this into the future. It's great to be a sponsor of this, and again, thank you for letting Travel Portland be associated with this program.
Thank you, everyone. We know that words have an opportunity to bring us together and unite us as a community. So we look forward to continuing this journey. We look forward to supporting your book, Dr. Burrows. And for everyone who's still with us today, we look forward to seeing you at future Association Forum events. Forum Forward is August 26th. Smart Tech Conference is September 30th. And our iconic Holiday Showcase, all events are virtual this year. Holiday Showcase as well is December 16th. Until next time, be well.